In 1881, a prairie town nearly went to war over a road. One man tried to own the land, the church, the rail, and eventually the money. What began as a prairie outpost of 200 souls will, by 2050, become a metropolis. This is a wild ride of capitalist settlers' bold and disastrous planning decisions, courageous feats and bitter rivalry. Told through my hand-drawn maps, a lightbox, historical photographs, and newspaper clippings. Before any American pioneer arrived, there was a creek, and the Winona people moved along it as part of their vast but shrinking territory. Along the creek lay a quiet cove with 2 small beaches. The water was calm with abundance of fish. Early explorers crossed here on horseback, at its narrowest point, travelling from north to south. Realizing the potential of the cove, they cut timber from nearby trees and built a simple dock. The trail was dangerous, and stories of violent attacks travelled with those who used it. The explorers fished here and hurled their catch back north. They named the route the Winona Trade Path. Time went on, and early settlers began to set up camp. Nothing permanent, mostly tents and scattered campfires. This stretch became known as Winona Bend. Rocks clung to the shoreline, and the current ran fast where the river narrowed into a tight curve upstream. Most settlers knew not to swim or attempt a crossing here, but one fateful day, John, aged 13, and his 2 younger brothers were swept from the rocks and drowned. The settlement paid homage to them by naming the outcrop in their honour. Soon, a settler with money arrived. A beguiling pioneer with a moustache too refined for this stretch of prairie, and a family of 12, a good Christian, hard-working and literate. His name, and do not forget it, is Mr. Theodore Silas Blaney of Kansas City. Having secured several acres along the creek through early filings, he upgraded the timber dock and laid claim to it. He even renamed the cove after himself. At the crossing of the Cedar River, he erected a timber sign warning travelers of the ford and vowed that one day he would build a proper bridge. Blaney began hiring men from the Winona settlement for protection, for labor, and for company. And together they pushed inland from the river, cutting a rough path through the prairie grass. 2 men grew especially close to him, Davenport and Henderson. In a running joke, Blaney named the wide flat prairie after Davenport's broad nose. He called it the Davenport Flats. The party eventually reached another creek and found a weathered post driven into the ground. It read, "Don't waste your time, no gold here." Blaney called it a bluff. Rumours of alluvial gold had drifted through the territory before, and he was not one to ignore them. He left Henderson and a small group of men to test the creek while he pressed farther south, continuing to cut brush and extend the trail. Over the months, more settlers arrived at the crossroads, and the region's first permanent structure was built, a coach inn, managed by a man who had married one of Blaney's daughters. Soon, Henderson's prospering camp abandoned the creek and joined the growing settlement near the inn. Rough streets began to form, lined with timber shacks and crude dwellings. The town square emerged early, and not for noble reasons. A hastily built set of gallows was raised for the public execution of the inn's manager after Blaney caught Johnstone in betrayal, not with a stranger, but with another of Blaney's daughters. The sentence was carried out swiftly, under the authority of the county sheriff, though many knew those who truly drove this desire. At that time, the county sheriff's circuit passed through the region only twice a year, leaving much of the day-to-day order in the hands of whoever held the most land and influence. The gallows stood for months afterward, the rope left hanging as a warning. In time, the site became a permanent landmark in the settlement's memory, nicknamed Cheater's Corner. If you want my advice, never plant your seed in the house of Blaney. More streets and timber dwellings began to rise. The Winona Trail, once dusty and narrow, was absorbed into the emerging town. Horse troughs appeared along the road, candle-lit flickered in windows at night, and a sense of permanence began to settle in. Blaney believed that if outside money arrived unchecked, his influence would weaken. So before other wealthy men could establish themselves, he financed the construction of several buildings, all under his ownership. Fees from dock use, land sales, and freight storage quietly filled his coffers long before the railroad arrived. He appointed his most loyal friends and workers to manage the new general store, blacksmith shop, post office, saloon, and livery stable. Everything a settlement of 100 souls required, and more for passing travellers. He named the stretch Main Street, and he was pleased. This was his town, a place to root his Christian values. A church was built, and attendance was strongly expected every Sunday. On Sabbath mornings, the streets lay quiet. A schoolhouse followed, intended for his children and any child baptized into the church. He petitioned the state for educational funds, and in time they were granted. Blaney's two most loyal men grew restless and wanted land of their own to raise families. Blaney was cautious, but he agreed, on his terms. He arranged for Davenport to acquire farmland to the east, on the condition that he safeguard the docks and keep order along the river road, particularly amongst rustlers or unrest along the frontier. Davenport worked the land hard and steadily built up his farm. To the west, Henderson was granted acreage near the creek and the former prospecting camp, though notably excluding a giant oak that stood alone in the prairie, where Blaney's children often played. Henderson brought in cattle and soon established a thriving ranch. Blaney, unwilling to leave the matter unsettled, formally squared off his own holdings to include the great oak. There he built an expansive homestead and cut a direct path to the water source. The road leading to his property, running past the church and schoolhouse, was graded and improved, and at his insistence, named in his honor. Then came a grim discovery. Settlers uncovered the remains of a former settlement. 8 dwellings burned to their frames, with human remains scattered among the ash. Christian crosses were found amongst the debris, and Blaney ordered a timber post erected in their memory, marking the site as sacred ground. The cause of the destruction was whispered about, but never formally recorded. The Winona still held land beyond the southern ridge, watching the settlement's expansion with guarded distance. As the town grew, Blaney moved to define its boundaries. He placed posts at the main approaches, noting the distance to Mill Creek and to the larger town of Cedar Bluff, signaling that this was no longer merely a camp, but a settlement with limits. To protect his self-declared town, Blaney organized a watch and petitioned the governor, whose ambitions aligned conveniently with his own, to recognize a formal law officer in the area. For the governor, fast-growing settlements meant tax revenue, rail expansion, and votes in the next election. And Blaney delivered on all three. A county sheriff was assigned jurisdiction, though many of the deputies were men loyal to Blaney. After Henderson's wife was publicly called a harlot and his business described as nothing more than a dirt road empire, Henderson sought to extend his property line to reach Blaney Street, hoping to secure legitimate street access for his ranch. Blaney refused. Henderson appealed to the governor and a mediation was held. Though no open war followed, trust between the two men fractured beyond repair. Their relationship would never recover after one fateful night. Henderson's 3 daughters were killed when their coach overturned on a poorly maintained stretch of road leading into town. The path, long neglected and rutted from heavy wagons, had become treacherous. The route had fallen outside the original survey lines and was never formally graded by the township, despite repeated complaints. Henderson blamed Blaney for failing to maintain the route and held him personally responsible. In grief and fury, Henderson gathered his men and built a roadside shrine at the site of the accident. He remained there for 3 days, keeping vigil. Meanwhile, Blaney quietly strengthened his watch, fearing retaliation should Henderson's mourning turn to violence. Over the following months, Blaney observed that more travelers were arriving, many seeking work on the farms and ranches. A new boarding house was constructed to house the influx. Yet Blaney soon judged that not all the men lodging there were of God-fearing variety. In response, a direct road was laid from the boarding house to the church. It became known as Church Street. On Sunday mornings, boarders were strongly encouraged and sometimes firmly escorted up that road to attend church service. Blaney invited the governor to visit, but the governor replied that he would only come if he could arrive by rail. The coach was too unreliable and dangerous. Determined, Blaney sought out investors and negotiated with the railroad company to extend a branch line into the settlement. He even partnered with Davenport to raise the necessary funds and guarantee the spur's profitability. Davenport believed prosperity was safer under Blaney than in open conflict. Henderson was not invited into the arrangement, a slight that deepened the divide between them. Construction crews arrived in the spring, laying ties and track at a pace that transformed the prairie in a matter of months. In time, the railroad reached the town, and the governor stepped off the first train to a great ceremony. Henderson, angered at being excluded, approached the governor to secure land near the rail depot for a warehouse. Quiet negotiations followed, and permissions were granted. Before long, Henderson had erected a warehouse beside the station to store his goods. Blaney responded in kind. He built his own warehouse, as did Davenport, but he did not stop there. Establishing another company under his control, Blaney acquired additional parcels with direct rail access. Henderson soon found his property squeezed, hemmed in by Blaney's expanding holdings to the north and south. Worse still, Blaney's grain enterprise began to dominate the station grounds. 3 silos rose beside the tracks, along with a raised loading platform and a wooden grain elevator. By the time 200 people called the settlement home, the governor pressed for formal incorporation. A name for the town was required. Blaney, unsurprisingly, proposed his own name. Henderson insisted the people decide. In a public vote, the settlers chose the name Robust, a word that had appeared in early rail survey notes describing the fertile prairie soil and robust yields expected from the land. In retaliation for the town people siding with Henderson on the naming, Blaney established a bank, the only one in town. If he could no longer dominate every acre and bit of land, he would control the town's credit and currency. Loans, mortgages, and grain advances now passed through his ledger. In December of 1881, a hard winter settled over the prairie. Henderson grew worried of hauling cattle and goods along the long, snow-choked route to the rail station. In frustration, he ordered a direct track cut across Blaney's property, daring him to object to it. Word spread that the matter would be settled at sundown if necessary. Blaney refused any public confrontation. Instead, he erected a gate along the disputed boundary and posted armed watchmen. When Henderson's men attempted to force passage, shots were fired. 3 men were wounded in the exchange. By the time the sheriff arrived to investigate, both sides laid claim to self-defense, and no charges were filed or laid. As the smoke cleared, Henderson faced Blaney and said only one thing: "This means war."